This is Ray Harryhausen. These are some figments of his bold imagination. With these hands, this master craftsman gave unforgettable shape to figures drawn from those depths where the creatures of myth, legend, and dream reside in all of us. They have beguiled children for half a century, haunted their memories as grown-ups, and influenced generations of movie special effects artists. Today, Ray Harryhausen is, like his creations, a legendary figure.
Fantasy is essentially a dream world, an imaginative world, and I don't think you want it quite real. You want an interpretation, and stop motion, to me, gives that added value of a dream world that you can't catch if you try to make it too real. And that's the essence of fantasy, isn't it? Transforming reality into the imagination.
The desire to create those transformations came to him early and suddenly. He was 13 years old when he was taken to see a sensational movie at Grauman's Chinese in his native Los Angeles. King Kong, that masterpiece of stop-motion animation, instantly and permanently entered our collective consciousness and proposed his life's work to Ray Harryhausen.
They had pictures of this big gorilla on top of the Empire State Building, so I got very curious, and one day my aunt gave us these tickets, and she went along with us, and my mother, and I walked into Grauman's Chinese Theater, and when I came out, I haven't been the same since. The theatricality, the showmanship, I just came out awestruck, and I realized what you could do with animation. I mean, it changed my life.
He got busy immediately, learning the rudiments of stop-motion animation by doing. He had a natural talent for the work, as these very early examples demonstrate. At first, his studio was the family garage. Later, his father built what they called his hobby house to accommodate Ray's expanding skills and vision.
And that was really the start of my experimentation. But I owe everything to this giant gorilla and the people who made it.
They were led by Willis O'Brien, a former newspaper cartoonist who'd been working in special effects since 1914. A school friend helped Ray meet him.
I called Willis O'Brien, and he was very courteous, and he invited me over to the studio. So I loaded some of my dinosaurs that I had made into a suitcase, took them over to MGM, and he gave me some wonderful advice. He said, your Stegosaurus's legs look like sausages. You've got to learn to develop the muscles.
O'Brien inspired him to enroll in art school, where he perfected his talents for drawing and sculpture, as these renderings he did for an unmade O'Brien project vividly demonstrate. When he was in art school, he also joined a science fiction club. At its weekly meetings, he made a lifelong friend.
And lo and behold, there was a young writer struggling to get his stories published, was Ray Bradbury. And that was my first meeting with Ray Bradbury.
He was crazy about the Lost World. He was crazy about King Kong, and I was similarly crazy. And we made a pact together, and we said, we're going to grow old but never grow up. We're going to stay 18 years, 19 years old, and we're going to love dinosaurs forever.
When he heard that I was reconstructing them and trying to put a film together, of course we became quite good friends, which lasted over the years.
At the time, Ray was working on Evolution. It was an attempt to tell the entire story of life's beginnings on Earth. and for a lone teenager, a hugely ambitious undertaking.
Evolution was a 16mm project, very ambitious when I look back at it. But in my naive way, I thought I could do it if I took a year and a half. So I started making all of these experiments with it. And I'm very grateful I did, even though the picture was never completed, because I got discouraged when I saw Fantasia. It covered the dinosaur sequence with Stravinsky's wonderful background music. And I thought, oh, they're covering the same ground, and they did it so beautifully, I might as well abandon it. But it wasn't for naught. I used all this footage that I had experimented with earlier as a sample of what I could do.
This woolly mammoth, created for evolution, is the earliest Ray Harryhausen model still in his possession.
I made a few tests of it, but I never actually got to shoot it as a sequence and part of the film. But I did cut up my mother's fur coat, and that was quite disturbing to some people, but I finally found out she didn't want it anymore, so I didn't get a whipping.
His father, Fred, and his mother, Martha, supported his work unstintingly and frequently collaborated with him. The dog's name, perhaps inevitably, was Kong.
Through the years, they became interested in what I was doing, and they encouraged me enormously, and it was most helpful, particularly in the periods when one gets discouraged quite easily because you think you may be on the wrong track.
His mammoth got a role in another uncompleted film about an alien from Jupiter. A school friend played the monster's victim. It brought him his first public recognition, a feature story in Popular Science magazine, which ran this picture.
Over the years, it gradually grew from just a hobby, which I did in my spare time, and it developed into a profession. My first professional job, of course, was with George Pal's Puppetoons. I spent 2 years on the first 12 Puppetoons that he had made for Paramount.
World War II interrupted his career, but not his professional development. He made this little film to demonstrate the instructional potential of stop-motion photography. He passed the war years in a Signal Corps unit, making such sequences for Army training films. One of his colleagues was Theodore Geisel, later better known as Dr. Seuss. He made this model of Geisel's Snafu, a comically bungling soldier, for a magazine cover. Army service also perfected his scrounging skills.
The Navy had thrown out all their outdated Kodachrome and just threw it out on a junk pile. So I retrieved it and had it stored away in my garage for quite a while. And when I came back from the Army, I didn't know quite how to use it up. So I thought, well, perhaps I could make some fairy tales for children.
Mother Goose was up to date, technologically speaking, and Ray gave a hip flip to the 4 nursery rhymes he included in the first of what would become a short series of children's films. It took only 2.5 minutes to tell the tale of the spider and the world's most famous arachnophobe. The other films in the series would devote their full 10 minutes to a single story. The first of them was Little Red Riding Hood.
When I started making the fairy tales after the war, my father was very helpful. He had been an engineer in the early days, and he made all the armatures for me from my designs for the puppet films.
Armatures are puppet skeletons. They're wooden or metal bones connected by ball and socket joints. This allows the puppet to hold any pose for a one-frame exposure, then be slightly changed for the next and the next. Linked together, these still shots, 24 per second, create the illusion of movement.
Oh, grandmother, what large eyes you have. All the better to see you with, my dear, said the wolf. And then Red Riding Hood saw clearly his long, sharp teeth. But, Granny, what great sharp teeth you have. All the better to eat you with, my dear.
And then, fortunately, my mother had talent of making little miniature costumes. So she dressed all the models of the puppets.
So when you have a background like that, where you have a stage set for you in the house, and you have a carpenter who can build for you, and a mother who can sew for you, my God, you have a perfect situation.
I wanted to make a simplified way of changing expressions on the figures, although I didn't want dialogue. If you have dialogue, you have to make a series of heads for each character using the vowels A, E, I, O, U. So I felt that if I made 10 extreme heads from a neutral expression in the head, and then make 10 extreme different expressions, like with the eyes closed, with the mouth open, with the mouth a broad grin, and these different extreme expressions, I could dissolve in 8 frames from one head to the other. So if you register them carefully, the dissolve gives the impression that the face is flexible, like a rubber face.
Hansel and Gretel was next. Originally, Ray had planned to include 10 or 15 titles in the series, but each new film was more technically sophisticated than the last. Rapunzel's hair, for instance, may have been an invitation to her prince, but it was a real challenge to the young animator. He found he was spending up to 4 months on each of these little films. If he were to do a long series, it would consume years of his life. Everything greedy King Midas touched turned to gold. Everything Ray touched turned to more time-consuming hours on a project with limited rewards. He decided to make just one more of the little films. The Tortoise and the Hare would have rounded his series off at an even half dozen, and Ray thinks it would have been the best of them all. But he completed only a couple of minutes worth of footage, seen here for the first time, when Ray received a call from Willis O'Brien offering him the chance to work with his beloved mentor on a feature film. That was Mighty Joe Young. He made this conceptual drawing for it in 1946, 3 years before it was released. In reality, of course, Mighty Joe was Teeny Joe.
He was a little model about 12 inches high. I helped Obi design him, and Marcel Delgado built the exterior.
Ray estimates that he animated about 85% of Joe's sequences. More than anyone else, he was responsible for developing the character of a curious, gentle creature who didn't know his own strength.
I felt the best way to do it was to give him one idiosyncrasy, that every time he got angry, he would pound the ground with his fist. So I found myself in these first scenes with a stopwatch and a canvas on the floor, and I would go through the action so I could feel inside what it felt like. And I even went so far as to become a vegetarian slightly and eat celery and carrots for my tea break rather than the conventional biscuit and coffee.
Like Kong before him, Joe was brought out of the wild to work in show business. The one-time heavyweight contender, Primo Carnera, was the easily sunken anchor of the tug-of-war team.
When you have a human, you have to try to keep in mind what a human would do in that situation. He had a fight with Primo Carnera on the stage, and he finally had to pick him up and hold him over his head. So that required very careful animation and keeping in mind what a real person would do if under those circumstances. You can't just have them kicking. You have to give them the impression that they were actually lifted by this gigantic creature, and do it in such a way that it's difficult to determine whether it's animated or live.
This integration of stop-motion and live-action footage was an art Ray would spend the rest of his career bringing to ever higher levels of perfection.
Ray and I both learned at a very early age not to listen to anyone else, to focus on your passion, to burn it with your glance, to become the dinosaur.
The beast from 20,000 Fathoms was also a beast from prehistory and from an old friend's imagination.
And Ray said, would you mind coming over and meeting my producer? The producer gave me a copy of the script they were working on and said, we need your help. Maybe you could help rewrite this for us. Would you mind reading it? So I went in the next room, read it, came out. They said, well, what do you think? Can you help us? I said, yes. But incidentally, this story of yours is very much like a short story of mine that was in the Saturday Evening Post 2 years ago, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. But the producer's jaw dropped, and I realized they had taken my story, forgotten where they had taken it from, and called me in to rewrite it. So I didn't have to say anything. I didn't make a fuss. The next day, a telegram arrived saying we want to buy the rights to The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And that's how the film got made. And I was walking along the shore one night, and I came upon the ruins of the old Venice Pier and the serpentine spinal cord of the roller coaster. And I said to my wife, I wonder what that dinosaur is doing lying here on the beach. And the foghorn blew in the night, that following night, and I sat up in bed and I said, of course, the dinosaur on the beach had heard the foghorn blowing, thought it was another dinosaur, swam for an encounter, discovered it was a foghorn and a lighthouse, and destroyed it and died.
In the film, he had to live on for a few more reels.
It was a short story, so there wasn't enough material for a complete feature.
In the expanded screen story, the Rhedosaurus eventually makes his way to New York. Like most provincials, he didn't know how to behave properly in the big city. This is the film's most famous image. It closely duplicated one Ray first created for one of his boyhood experiments. The picture was also a surprise box office success and led to a meeting that would shape his future.
There was a young producer who wanted to make a picture about an octopus tearing down the Golden Gate Bridge. So I thought, well, that's rather an interesting challenge. So I went over to the studio to meet him, and his name was Charles Schneer.
What interested me was putting something on the screen that nobody else had on the screen, which was difficult to find. And I was interested in visuals and locations that had not been photographed, and I was also interested in leaving California to find those locations, because every rock, every tree within 50 miles of Los Angeles had been photographed.
The Golden Gate Bridge was only 400 miles away, and it had been photographed aplenty, but not in quite the way they planned to do it in It Came from Beneath the Sea.
We submitted the script to the San Francisco City Fathers, and they came back with the answer that they wouldn't cooperate because they were afraid that any destruction to the new bridge they had just built would suggest that it's not very substantial. So we had to, through devious means, I might say, we put a camera in the back of a bakery truck and drove back and forth over the bridge to get the background plates. We were trying to do a very spectacular type of story with very little money. The budget was so low that I found that if I had an octopus, 2 less tentacles to animate would save some money on the special effects and time. Time is money, of course. So I cut off 2 tentacles, and actually we had a sextopus. We kept them disguised underneath the water because nobody would count them, we didn't think.
Ray's little secret was eventually betrayed in a magazine read by fantasy film fans. But it didn't spoil anyone's fun.
I don't think there were any repercussions. I don't recall the city fathers banning the picture. I'm sure that no one really worried about an octopus pulling down the Golden Gate Bridge. I seem to be a very A destructive person. I like to do things of a mass destruction.
For example, this attack on the nation's capital by alien invaders. The year was 1956.
Charles Schneer liked to take clippings out of the newspaper in the morning, and there was a big ado about flying saucers. So our next project became Earth versus the Flying Saucers. I went to Washington with a still camera and photographed all the locations I wanted, and then we sent a special cameraman to photograph the backgrounds based on my storyboard of photographs. And that was a challenge to work on because I'd never used animation before for mechanical things like a spaceship. So I felt we could do things that you couldn't do ordinarily and took it on as a challenge.
The thing about Ray's work that is so amazing is how bold he is. Look at Earth versus the Flying Saucers. You've got these flying saucers. And you've seen those in other movies, like Day the Earth Stood Still. And in that movie, they just sort of come and land, and they kind of like don't even want to show it. But Ray's movies, they're right there. He came up with great angles, great ideas, great dynamics that they could fly, and he was not afraid to show you the star of the movie.
You had to have a certain amount of destruction or you couldn't get the picture off the ground. So I ended up with the saucers crashing into the Capitol Dome and knocking over the Washington Monument. I'm glad to see they still stand today.
Ideally, these scenes should have been shot by high-speed cameras, which create, paradoxically, ultra-slow-motion images. These, in turn, give the illusion that light, tiny objects have the weight of large ones when they fall. But this was low-budget filmmaking. They couldn't afford the cameras.
So I had to resort to animating all this destruction frame by frame. And I ended up, when the Washington Monument was hit by a flying saucer, each piece of brick that fell out of the monument had to be on a separate wire. As the saucer plowed through the Washington Monument, cutting it in two,
and you can sense a person made it.
Spoil anyone's fun.
I don't think there were any repercussions. I don't recall the city fathers banning the picture. And I'm sure that no one really worried about an octopus pulling down the Golden Gate Bridge. I seem to be a very destructive person. I like to do things of a mass destruction.
For example, this attack on the nation's capital by alien invaders. The year was 1956.
Charles Schneer liked to take clippings out of the newspaper in the morning, and there was a big ado about flying saucers. So our next project became Earth versus the Flying Saucers. I went to Washington with a still camera and photographed all the locations I wanted, and then we sent a special cameraman to photograph the backgrounds based on my storyboard of photographs. And that was a challenge to work on because I'd never used animation before for mechanical things like a spaceship. So I felt we could do things that you couldn't do ordinarily and took it on as a challenge.
The thing about Ray's work that is so amazing is how bold he is. Look at Earth versus the Flying Saucers. You've got these flying saucers. And you've seen those in other movies, like Day the Earth Stood Still. And in that movie, they just sort of come and land, and they kind of like don't even want to show it. But Ray's movies, they're right there. He came up with great angles, great ideas, great dynamics that they could fly, and he was not afraid to show you the star of the movie.
You had to have a certain amount of destruction or you couldn't get the picture off the ground. So I ended up with the saucers crashing into the Capitol Dome and knocking over the Washington Monument. I'm glad to see they still stand today.
Ideally, these scenes should have been shot by high-speed cameras, which create, paradoxically, ultra-slow-motion images. These, in turn, give the illusion that light, tiny objects have the weight of large ones when they fall. But this was low-budget filmmaking. They couldn't afford the cameras.
So I had to resort to animating all this destruction frame by frame. And I ended up, when the Washington Monument was hit by a flying saucer, each piece of brick that fell out of the monument had to be on a separate wire. As the saucer plowed through the Washington Monument, cutting it in two,
you can sense a person made it, that it's a person struggling with a medium to present themselves.
That person was also struggling to leave Hollywood.
Elementals was planned to be in Paris, where these creatures nestled in the Eiffel Tower, because I wanted a trip to Europe. I got itchy feet, and the only way I could see to get to Europe was to make some location there, and then I would be sent for nothing, so and be paid for it. But it was never produced.
They were humanoid bats, and Ray plays their victim in this test footage, all that survives of the project. If he was literally carried away by his idea, no one else was. But he would get his trip anyway, and soon enough make his permanent base in London. His deliverance was the Emir. Brought back from Venus by a space probe, he was originally supposed to land in Chicago. But 50s film economics supported Ray's wanderlust. 20 million miles to Earth were shot in Rome.
I wanted a humanoid creature because, having had experience with Mighty Joe Young, I felt you could do much more with a humanoid type of creature, although we didn't want to make it a man. He was taken out of his element and brought to Earth in a strange environment.
When the creature hatches at the beginning and comes up and kind of rubs its eyes, and you just really feel an empathy for that guy. And that's true through all his films, that empathy for character. It's an actor. We're looking at an animated actor on the screen.
So the Emir, we wanted to make him sympathetic. He was taken out of his element.
Two things changed the Emir from a harmless little guy into a menace. The hostility of Earthlings as they confronted an alien figure, and a curious addiction to sulfur. It accelerated his growth and perhaps exacerbated his temper.
He wasn't really aggressive until the dog and the farmer became aggressive to him. And he finally got quite vicious because he was tortured and tormented by man. The poor boy was just a helpless soul out of his environment. And he finally ended up in Rome atop the Colosseum. Of course, that was influenced by Kong on top of the Empire State Building. I thought it would be a rather dramatic way of ending it. The film, man, of course, destroys what he doesn't understand. I've been responsible for destroying New York, San Francisco, and Washington, and we kind of got tired out of doing these destructive pictures constantly, which were popular in the 50s.
So we took the path of action, we took the path of suspense, we took the path of imagination.
That path was illuminated by drawings Ray had made some years earlier to illustrate his ideas for a movie about the adventures of Sinbad, the legendary Arabian sailor.
The origin of the Seventh Voyage came a few years after Mighty Joe. I wanted to find a new outlet, and I developed these 8 big sketches based on the adventures of Sinbad. I felt he was a personification of adventure.
When I saw those drawings, I was absolutely overwhelmed by them. And I didn't need any more than those drawings to sell it to the distributor. And that was our first color picture.
It was also Ray's first experiment with his signature creation, the living skeleton.
The skeleton was really the inspiration of going to Sinbad when I first started making my drawings. And in Sakura's castle, I think it came off as a possibility because he could animate inanimate objects through his black magic.
The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad starred Kerwin Matthews and Catherine Grant. But it was Ray's stop-motion artistry that made it one of the surprise hits of 1958. And in its influence on the next generation of special effects people, one of the more significant movies of its time.
For me, there's nothing like being trapped in a cave with one skeleton, because in this cave in Sinbad, you can't get away.
Matthews, playing Sinbad, was, in Ray's words, a master at maintaining the illusion that he was actually dueling with an imaginary creature. In reality, the skeleton was not tricked into the film until months after principal photography was completed.
I was about 5 years old, and at its first theatrical release, I saw Seventh Voyage of Sinbad with my mom. It had a very profound effect on me.
I saw it 8 times the first week it came out. And I had, which is very hard when you're like 12 years old, and you have to find friends and relatives or neighbors that'll drive by the movie theater to drop you off so you can see the movie over and over again. It was just something about that Cyclops standing on the beach, the kind of orange skin and the blue sky, and the spectacle of it that I had never seen in any other film.
For many years, I even had dreams about the Cyclops growing in the family fish tank, living there, but always on the verge of bursting out and coming after me.
In classical mythology, you find the Cyclops quite often, but never the size we made him. We tried to give him a proportion so that people would find him rather awesome. And I think he worked out quite well, particularly when he had an encounter with the dragon.
Just as Ray had looked to Willis O'Brien as a mentor, young craftsmen would soon be looking to him in the same way. Dennis Muren, who has gone on to win 8 Oscars, among them.
It was a wonderful experience. I'll never forget those times going out to visit him. And one time I was looking around in his garage, and up in the rafters of the garage something was sticking out. There was like a wooden skull of something going behind some boxes. I couldn't see what it was, and it was all in pieces, and it was the dragon from the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And I just thought, oh, what a sad end for such a wonderful creature.
There was almost a note of irony. I mean, I thought the Cyclops, I liked him. I didn't like getting beaten by the dragon, which was more ruthless. I absolutely believed in the reality of the worlds he created, the marriage of the live and stop motion.
Ray's dreams ranged far and wide. As a youth, he had wanted to retell the David and Goliath story. He went so far as to make this test footage for a Baron Munchausen film. He loved vast contrasts in scale. They could be charming, as well as terrifying. As he proved in The 3 Worlds of Gulliver. Since he and Schneer couldn't afford major movie stars, these figures, stars in the world's collective consciousness, stood in for them, very successfully.
We needed material that the public had recognized, characters that had been around for a very long time. And I remember reading that the book most looked at in American public libraries at that time was Jules Verne's A Mysterious Island. And we made that picture.
Like most of Ray's films, it was the story of an heroic voyage. In this case, in an exotic and fragile vehicle.
We kept the original escape during the Civil War with this balloon because we felt that would make a very exciting opening for the picture. And Bernard Herrmann's music has always struck me for that sequence as most dynamic.
Suscríbete y toca la campanita. Así podremos avisarte cada vez que haya un nuevo vídeo disponible. Déjanos tus comentarios y dinos, ¿te gusta el arte de Harryhausen? ¿Qué te parece la stop motion?